Okay.
Sorry, I forgot that I muted myself. Sorry, give me 1 second here, guys. Is it sharing my presenter mode or the
Yeah, we're seeing it.
presenter mode or the main PowerPoint?
No, we're seeing the main PowerPoint.
Okay, so there's no like black
No,
blotches everywhere.
No,
Okay,
it's fine.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, guys. Thank you for bringing me here today to talk. And thank you for coming together to celebrate Bat Week with me. I don't know if you did that on purpose, but we do love to see that. So tonight I'm going to be walking you through my research studying the northern long-eared bat on coastal islands like your own Long Island. This listed bat species appears to be surviving despite infection with the devastating disease white nose syndrome, as was read in my introduction there. And I've spent the last few years attempting to learn why. But first, I did just want to do, in the spirit of Bat Week, give you a quick refresher on the bats of Long Island and white nose syndrome, so we can all make sure we're on the same page there. Are my Zoom windows in the corner here? Is that visible? Sorry. Let me move them. Maybe that'll help. Okay. Good? Yes? Okay. Sorry about that. So there are 9 different bat species that can be found in New York State. We can break these guys down into 2 categories based on their behavioral response to decreased food, decreased food availability in the winter. We have our tree bats and our cave bats. The tree bats are a migratory species, though they'll travel south in the warmer weather to locate greater food abundance, whereas our cave bats are species that hibernate in caves and mines to make it throughout the winter. The bats listed here in red are going to be the bats identified on Long Island, either through rabies lab submissions, acoustics, or mist netting. So to jump into our tree bats here, they tend to be larger overall in size and wingspan relative to our cave bat species. Likely due to an effect of migration, which requires flight over long distances. Diagram in the top right here, I'll circle that for you guys. It's actually a diagram of a wing aspect ratio versus wing loading, which might be something you're familiar with in regards to birds. So if you look at both of our silver-haired and hoary bats, these are our largest guys, and they're actually going to be kind of represented here in the upper left-hand corner. They're slow flyers that can traverse only open air, but they travel very, very long distances. Our red bats are going to fall into our top right category here. They are fast flyers for their size and are capable of flying in both open and cluttered habitats. And then this is the bat you actually see coming out most often earlier in the day, that you can see them when it's still light out. And they're pretty distinctive to identify. They have this like bright red coppery orange fur and white fluff on their belly that's super visible. And then just as long as Long Island serves as an important flyover for birds on their migration route, it actually holds a similar function for bats, with large numbers passing through in the fall. In recent years, we've actually observed instances of both red bats as well as silver-haired bats being found on Long Island in the midwinter months, kind of indicating they are likely hibernating in the most northern parts of their range. And then kind of jumping into our hibernation aspect of it. So when all of our tree bats are heading south, our cave bats will actually be heading into hibernation. So they're leaving their summer and fall roosts and going to their winter hibernacula, which would be caves or mines. And they're doing this because they're actually a more a stabilized temperature as compared to staying in the trees and the bridges or houses that they would be in. And hibernation is absolutely a necessary function for bats in the winter because of the food availability. They aren't able to sustain themselves with the physiological costs associated with flying when it's so cold and there's so few insects on the landscape. So they must go into a physiological state of decreased temperature to kind of offset that. Prior to entering these caves and mines, the bats are actually going to increase their fat reserves. That's their main energy source during hibernation. So these little brown bats will actually have been documented increasing their body weight by more than 30%. Usually they're only weighing 6 to 8 grams. So we've tracked them up to 12 right before they go into a cave or a mine. And then during hibernation, they're going to, decrease their physiological functions. So their heart rate, their metabolic rate, respiration, and immune functions, and their body temperature will lower as well. So it's nearly the same as the cave or the mine they're roosting in. And that's kind of why that stable cave temperature is so important. They're so susceptible to fluctuations. So most bats need that. You will find some big browns that'll roost in houses. So those guys, they can handle a little bit more cold temperature ranges. During hibernation, the bats actually will wake up every 12 to 19 days for arousal. And this is a normal function. It's how they get their metabolic rates going again. They start their immune functions. They can drink some water, sometimes even reproduce, depending on the species. But these arousals are incredibly energetically demanding, and they'll quickly burn through all the fat stores these bats would have built up during the fall foraging. So to run through the bats we have here on Long Island, there's the little brown bat. They were once the most common bat species in New York State, but their population has absolutely been decimated by white nose syndrome. They've suffered the largest losses. So in New York State, it's actually over 250,000 bats we've lost alone. Fortunately, this population appears to be stabilizing and might even be increasing again, although that is now we're 15 years after the initial infection. So hopefully it doesn't take that long for some of these other species or for the regions that are being affected right now. And they actually have been detected both in Nassau and Suffolk County on Long Island. But since there are no caves or mines down here, we're believing that these bats will return to the mainland to hibernate there in the winter. We have our northern long-eared bat. That's the bat that I spent all my time studying and researching. They have a pretty huge range, but they are declining drastically in New York State, 99% decline in New York at the height of white nose. And it's actually being extirpated throughout most of its range. So that's led to its listing. It's both federally and state listed as a threatened species. That happened in 2015. But it is currently being considered for an upgrade to endangered at the federal level. And all signs are pointing to that happening. And despite it being nearly extirpated from the mainland, there actually does appear to be a remnant population living here on Long Island. So you guys are quite lucky. And we have detected it in both Nassau and Suffolk County, and there are known hibernation sites in in Suffolk County. And they look very similar to the little brown bat, but their tragus, if you can see there, is actually at least half the length of their ear. So if you're looking at between the two, it's not too easy to tell unless you have them in hand, maybe a little ruler to measure them apart. The tricolored bats, another species that actually of special interest to me. They're similar to the northern long-eared in that they've experienced these massive population declines throughout most of their range. And it is also currently being considered for listing both federally and in the state level. And once again, it looks like it's going to go through. So these guys will soon have protection as well. But what's so interesting to me is that we actually just discovered a few years ago now, but we did find the first maternity colony of tricolored bats known in New York State. And we found it in Nassau County over by Locust Valley. We have actually tracked them to a hibernation site in Eastern Long Island as well. So we've got these guys on your island. So soon to be some more protection for your green spaces as well. And these guys are pretty distinctive in hibernation sites. They're always covered in condensation. They have this little walnut shape when they roost. This blonde fur if they're not covered in condensation, and this red forearm. And then our big brown bat. This is the last cave bat you might find on Long Island. And this guy would be the one you're most likely to find in your attics, your garages. They're kind of known as an urban bat. They really like urban areas. They don't seem to be as affected by artificial light. This, like I said, this bat is pretty common on Long Island, and it would be probably the most common bat that you guys might encounter alongside the red bat that I had mentioned prior. And what's nice about big brown bats, at least for them, is that they don't seem to be affected by white nose syndrome. They can still be infected with the disease, but they don't have the same symptoms. So their population has not really been affected at all by the disease. And they are distinctive because of their bulldog face. They have these glands that kind of are on the side of their face, and it makes them pretty easy to tell apart. And then I just want to touch briefly on the disease. So white nose syndrome, it's a disease called by a psychrophilic fungus, Gymnascus destructans, or Pseudogymnascus destructans. So that's PD, I'll kind of refer to it as. And so PD is a cold-loving fungus. It thrives in caves and mines, pretty much everything that makes up a hibernation site. And this disease was first discovered in these caves in Albany and Schoharie County. So New York was the ground zero, the epicenter of it. It was found in 2006 originally, and within a few years of that, the mass mortality events were seen. So the way this fungus works, it invades the dermis and epidermis of the bat. So you can see it here on the wing, causing fungal lesions, and then on the face there. And when it does this invasion, it kind of causes all these pathophysiological responses that the bat will experience. And these fruiting bodies of the fungus will actually pop through the skin at the top, and that's when they start to give off their spores. And that's where the white nose name comes from, because it can pop through the skin of the nose, the wings, the feet. So the exact mechanisms of how this disease works, the pathology, they're not quite understood, but what we do know are the symptoms that the disease that the bat will present. So they always have wing damage, there'll be abnormal roosting or flight behaviors, and this increased arousal frequency. So as I mentioned before, arousals are they really quickly break down the energy stores built up for hibernation, and bats kind of go into hibernation with the perfect number to make it out in the spring alive. But with white nose syndrome, it's actually causing them to wake up more often, which is ultimately leading to dehydration and starvation. So a little more about PD, the fungus. It's an invasive species that arrived from Europe in 2006, like I said, but actually in Europe, it co-evolved with the bat species there, and they don't seem to be affected by the disease like the bats in the US are. Like all fungus, it does reproduce through sporulation, which makes it very difficult to remove from a habitat. You'll know if you've ever had fungus growing in your yard and you're trying to clear it out and get fresh grass again. And this difficulty is actually compounded by the fact that the fungus does not need the bats to survive. So if all the bats in a cave died, the fungus would actually stay there and could live in the cave indefinitely. So it wouldn't be until maybe 10 years later, bats move back in, but they would be infected instantly with the same fungus. And so humans are actually kind of responsible for helping to spread this disease. Like I said, it was believed a human was the one who originally brought it to the US. It's also believed humans have helped spread it across the country. And that's because these tiny spores can kind of hitchhike on clothing as well as other bats to infect other sites. And then there's some nationwide species implications of white nose syndrome. So, it's a big deal in New York, but it's actually a big deal across the country. This disease has actually killed over 6 million bats since white nose began. So if you can imagine any sort of bird species, if you lost 6 million of something, how that would affect your ecosystem. And though there are some species unaffected, like I said, the big brown bat, or the small-footed bat, they both seem to show tolerance, or even the migratory bats, the tree bats, don't seem to be affected because they don't hibernate in the same way. These bats are still spreading into other places. So these migratory bats, they're coming from New York, then they're going down to the south to go, hibernate, spend the winter. They're bringing it down there. Bats that are going further across the coast from further towards the center of the country. So it's having huge effects on the disease spread as well. And there are obviously ecological impacts of white nose taking out so many bats. As you can imagine, bats are huge pest controls, either agricultural pests, forest pests. So the loss of them would be a huge problem for the agricultural industry. Losing bats also causes an increase in pesticide use. And then even on, Long Island, I've had folks come up to me during some of my field days telling me that they have more mosquitoes, even though their towns are doing more spraying. And that's because you're losing huge numbers of little brown bats that used to be out on your island, as well as northern long-eared bats. And for me, I'm kind of worried about potentially losing tequila. The agave plant which is used to make tequila, is pollinated exclusively by bats. So if that bat species ends up being infected with white nose syndrome and is decimated like the northern long-eared, it could lead to loss of tequila. But unlike other mammals of their sizes, bats are incredibly long-lived. They actually only have 1 to 2 babies each year, pups. So that's a really slow recovery for them. It leads to a slow population recovery, but it also leads to a very slow time to build up a genetic resistance. So in flies or mice, things that breed very regularly, you can get these gene mutations that can help offset a new kind of endemic, a pandemic like this, the white nose syndrome. But with bats, it's not really something that they think will happen because of how slowly they reproduce. And so just to look at how white nose syndrome has spread across the US, it's pretty incredibly telling to watch it move here. Yeah, so that gets us all the way to 2019. And then they kind of changed the map a little bit, so it's not as pretty to say, but we have it spreading across the country now. We've got California in there, Montana, and then it's actually just expanding. Texas blew up from one year to the next. So as you can see, in the past 15 years since white nose first hit the East Coast, that's the red X there in the corner. The disease is absolutely spread, and you can find it in 37 states, 7 Canadian provinces where the bats are actually dying from white nose syndrome, and 3 states where the bats, where the fungus has been found, but it hasn't been found on bats yet. So all the issues that New York has dealt with and the bats in New York are dealing with, they're coming for the West Coast, and the problems with the West Coast bats in the Northwest, they haven't studied the hibernaculas, the caves and the mines like we have. The landscape is so huge and there's so much space that they haven't been able to track where they are. So any sort of cures, ideas of spraying bats with an antifungal or giving them, feeding them before they go into hibernation, giving them some sort of way to build up their energy stores, it won't work when you don't know where the bats are hibernating. So they're a lot less prepared to deal with it, even though they've had this kind of 15 years to build up to it. And then to kind of look at the northern long-eared bat, the kind of main focus of our study in relation to that map, you see that, I'll go back for a second, pretty much everywhere white nose syndrome is, the northern long-eared bat, that's their range. And, obviously there's tons of bats that are being affected, but, here on the East Coast, we've seen it, but the northern long-eared bat is very severely affected, and this is why. So in 2015, Winifred Frick, she's the author that kind of had this paper here, and this is a quick scientific journal thing I'll jump into for you. She discovered that a species probability of local extinction was linked to the original colony size. So these bats that are a larger colony, bats that are starting with 100,000 bats, 200,000 bats, they're a lot less likely to be extirpated from white nose. There is, however, one exception to this rule, the northern long-eared bat. So these 2 graphs examine the relationship between the pre-invasion colony size, so pre-invasion referring to before white nose syndrome, and survival. So the graph on the left here, this pictures colonies spreading throughout the Northeast, and you see New York there as well. With the size of the circle, that represents an index for colony size, and the red is indicating the extinct colonies, so colonies that have no bats anymore. So you can see all these local extinctions, anywhere that it's red, those are all the smallest circles. Whereas the northern long-eared bat, if you look at their graph, almost every single circle is red. So didn't matter if it was a big hibernacula with a bunch of them or a small one. If there's not northern long-eared bats in the hibernacula and they had white nose, they almost always went extinct. The graph on the right kind of explores this a bit further. So it's looking at the probability of local extinction related to colony size, with larger colonies being the most likely to survive. So, and even with the large northern long-eared bat here, you're staying stable at 75%. So essentially, whenever the northern long-eared bat gets white nose syndrome, they're going to die. And that kind of brings us to our research here on Long Island. So as I mentioned, upstate, they're about 99% reduced. We almost never see them in caves or mines anymore. I think in the past 5 years of winter surveys that I've done, I've only seen maybe 4. If you do acoustic studies, you don't see them. If you go out netting, you could net 100 nights upstate and you wouldn't catch a single one. But the rabies lab submissions for Long Island kept telling us that northern long-eared bats were still here. And then a researcher in 2014 actually went out and he caught a bunch. So we came down and we started our research, and this is a research based, it's a joint project between SUNY Albany and New York State DEC. So I work for the DEC, as does my colleague, who's also doing this research for a PhD. And our research was looking at just finding out everything we could about these bats here on Long Island. So to do that, we ended up mist netting them, doing acoustic surveys. So this picture here on the bottom is going to be the canopy cover study that my colleague did. And she just put out acoustic detectors in 50 different canopy covers across Long Island to see if the northern long-eared bats are out there and under what conditions. And then we use that data to figure out where to go netting for them in the fall, which turned out that the eastern end of Long Island is the best place for northern long-eared bats. Further east you go in the season, towards the end of the season, the more you'll find. And we were able to do our captures. So we do mist netting, which I'm sure you're all quite familiar with. And then we did radio tracking, which I'm not sure what the smallest radio tracker you guys have used, but I know there's quite a good number of small birds out there. For our bats, we're using transmitters that are, the bats weigh 5 to 8 grams, so we're using transmitters that are 5% of their body weight. Unfortunately, that means their lifespan is only about 3 weeks. We do have a lot of bats captured and not so many hibernacula found. So what we were doing is capturing our bats in the fall and trying to time it so that we could track them to wherever they're roosting on Long Island, because they weren't in our caves upstate. So we assumed they must be staying down here. And we were somewhat successful and able to find these hibernacula, these sites. And in doing that, we found out the bats all here, they have white nose disease. It's in their hibernaculas. It's in their, whenever we swab them, we pick it up in the spring and the fall. And we are doing our study across multiple islands as well. But then the question became, how are these bats surviving? Because as Winifred Frick told us in her study, if these bats get white nose syndrome, the northern long-eared bat, if they're exposed to it, they almost always die from it. And yet here we're catching them in numbers that you'd expect pre-white nose. So that brings me to my paper, my specific research. How is this coastal population able to persist? And so it's kind of a three-prong idea here. There's a warmer coastal climate that's leading to behavioral adaptations. And mind you, hibernation is a behavior. So it's these changes to their hibernation behavior, where they're roosting, how long they're doing it. And that offsets the effects of the disease. So it's a kind of 3 objectives that I was working through. The first being to establish landscape activity patterns for these northern long-eared bats. So looking at when they use the landscape and when they're hibernating. And then looking at the same kind of activity patterns for potential prey species, because my idea was, if bats are only going into hibernation with such a small number of fat cells that they can use, and these bats are surviving down here, then there must be something else happening related to food. And then my third objective is to look at the prey species through guano analysis to see if the bats that I'm capturing, the bugs that I'm capturing in the wintertime are the same as the bats are eating. So as I mentioned, Long Island has a very specific coastal climate. So under the Köppen climate classification system, it's humid, subtropical on the eastern end, and then a humid continental climate the further west you go. So that kind of means as these hot, humid summers and these mild, cold winters, still somewhat 4 distinct seasons, but you get that ocean climate kind of muting how effective or how aggressive the winters would be. So as I said, establish our hibernation patterns here. And this is actually a photo from one of our Long Island site. So we did track bats to hibernation sites on Long Island, and they are using atypical hibernation sites down here, specifically crawl spaces. And so this graph is just looking at the northern long-eared bat acoustic files against our daily temperature. This is from a capture location where no known hibernacula is nearby. So our black line here, that's going to represent our average temperature of the day. The blue buffer here is a daily temperature range. And we are finding that our bats are actually active much more than we thought. So at 0 degrees Celsius, freezing, The bats, there's only a 25% chance a bat would emerge, but at 5 degrees Celsius, there's about a 50% chance a bat would emerge. When you get up to 10 degrees Celsius, that's over 70%. And these are temperatures where you wouldn't be seeing bats upstate. And also, we are seeing bats active on the landscape well below freezing. So this is something to consider when we're looking at how to set up our study. And then breaking it into our landscape activity of our bats. This is kind of our activity pattern that I was hoping to establish. It's important to note that this doesn't follow typical hibernation behavior or typical hibernation activity. So usually in the fall, bats would go into hibernation in late October, maybe early November, and they wouldn't emerge until late April or early May. Here we're seeing our bats active, to a degree throughout the entire winter time, but huge spikes in activity in like late November time, and then again in late February to early March. So this is representing a shortened hibernation period. So this could enable the bats to potentially survive even without winter feeding, if they're able to, if they're only going into hibernation later and coming out earlier than the bats upstate would be. And then this is looking at kind of our comparison of our hibernaculas. We have the one on Long Island and one on Martha's Vineyard. But what we were trying to do is track acoustics within the sites to give us an idea of arousals, right? So as I mentioned, upstate bats can only arouse a certain number of times. And we wanted to see if these bats were arousing more or less. So there are some issues with this data. Specifically, the breaks there that you see on the graphs would be when our detectors stop working, which is unfortunate. But despite all that, we are able to determine that the bats' arousals, or at least when they're vocalizing within the hibernation site, they may not necessarily vocalize every time they wake up, but when they do vocalize on Long Island, it looks like it's about an average of every 13 days. Martha's Vineyard, it's every 4 days. So those are typical of the Martha's Vineyard is, typical of a highly infected, severely infected white nose individual. The Long Island is on the, the upper range of that. So it's not, it's a little bit more typical of a healthy bat, which is why it is unfortunate that we do have these holes in our data, in our recordings. But what is interesting is that every time our bats went outside, because we had detectors both inside and outside the hibernation site, or not every time, but 63% of the time we did detect bats, both or insects on the landscape as the bats were outside. So it appears that the bats are leaving their hibernation site somewhat often. And when they do go out, there are insects out there for them to feed on. And then looking at the same kind of data for 2019, 2020, you'll see I did include our tricolored site on here because I thought it was somewhat interesting. You'll see our tricolored bat, the PESU, PESU on the purple there. It looks like it's arousing way more frequently, which is, an indication that this species might not be doing as well, even on the Long Island ecosystem. But once again, there are still quite a few breaks there. So the arousals aren't easy to discern, but you'll see our Long Island single hibernacular arousal range drop down to an average of 4 days, which is curious because we actually are seeing a decrease in the number of bats that we're capturing on the landscape. So we were somewhat concerned that we might be running out of bats, that they might actually be dying off. Or maybe it's a delayed kind of disease infection. So something to consider as we move forward in the study. Do our next objective, identifying the activity patterns of the potential prey species throughout the winter, and how does this insect activity correspond to bat activity? So just a bit of background about the northern longyear bat. They are mainly a moth strategist, but they have earned the title of an opportunistic forager. So that means that pretty much if they can fit it in their mouths, they'll eat it. If it's worth capturing, they'll eat it. And they have been documented on feeding on a wide variety of different insects. They actually use 2 different strategies, which makes them really capable of capturing a lot of things. So they can grab insects off vegetation, or they can also catch things in the air. And the idea of them grabbing things off vegetation, I found super interesting when I was first getting started in my research, because a lot of the winter or fall insects will actually climb up trees and vibrate their wings until they raise themselves to a temperature warm enough to sustain flight. And if an insect's on a tree shaking its wings, that's a perfect target for a bat that can fly through cluttered habitats and pick them up off trees. So seems like a match made in heaven for these bats. And then, I was able to find quite a few insects that looked like they would be the perfect specimen for bats. So I was able to set up my research study here. So the survey protocol I set up was across the 3 islands. As I'd mentioned, we are looking at both Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, but I'm trying to focus most of what I'm telling you here just on Long Island. But they do seem to like these beautiful coastal islands. But each of my insect traps, they were run by a bunch of community volunteers. And the goal was to spread these across two types of trap per site. So a UV light trap and a sugar bait trap to maximize the number of insects we could find. The trap location where we placed them was kind of based off of proximity to hibernacula or known bat habitat, places where we had a lot of bat activity in our acoustic studies that my colleague had been doing. And then due to this ephemeral nature of insects, we were trying to survey at least twice a month with a minimum temperature of 5 degrees Celsius, since that was what the majority of the literature stated was the minimum flying temperature. I ended up lowering that cutoff midway through because a bunch of my volunteers were finding bats or insects coming out way more frequently than that. And a bunch of my survey volunteers were able to go out way more often than twice a month. So just so you can see where the sites were distributed, we have, like I said, where all of our bat activity is on the east end of Long Island. So the ones in red would be the failed, either the volunteers weren't able to go out enough or they didn't do it properly, which is, something that happens sometimes with volunteer projects. And then the little bats are the acoustic monitoring long-term sites that we had. And then the black would all be our successful. So you can see we have a nice spread across the island there. And Nantucket ended up not being able to do anything. So we were kind of just set with these sites. And then I did expand a bit in 2019, 2020 to get an upstate site as a comparison to see if the insect activity changes the further you get upstate, which it did. And then kind of just looking at this is, some of what the volunteers found for us. And as I mentioned, the literature said insects would only be coming out at 5 degrees or more, but we are seeing insects 79% of the time if the temperature was 5 degrees and higher, and then 60% of the time below 5 degrees Celsius. So there are still insects active on the landscape, irrelevant of that 5 degrees threshold cutoff, which is interesting because we are seeing bats coming out well below freezing as well. So although it might not be ideal conditions for either, it seems that even when the bats are emerging in these cold nights, the insects are sometimes there as well. And then looking at a direct comparison of our insect activity and our bat activity, they actually resemble each other quite a bunch, very similar activity patterns. So it does appear that the spring bat activity increases a few weeks before the insects. The insects you see have a little bit more right in the middle of March, whereas the bats are coming out more frequently. But I would like to, kind of caution that with the this results, the bats, we had acoustic detectors out every day. So every single day we have a yes or no. With the insect studies, we only have surveys on days where volunteers could go out or volunteers, the temperature let them go out. So there's possibilities that we're missing occurrences there. And then just to look at some of the insects that we were finding. So these are some fall moths. They're usually active in the fall, but we actually found them appearing all throughout the season. So these guys, the cankerworm, that's the one on the top. He's from almost all my sites. He was quite popular. And then the one on the bottom there is usually only out until October, but we found them well into April. So interesting. We have some spring moths here. They're usually the species that emerge with the warm weather, usually in April. But we're documenting these species coming out way earlier than you would see. The Hypena scabra, for example, was out all winter long. And this is kind of lending to the idea that this mild coastal climate isn't just, something to laugh at. It's actually allowing all these insects that usually wouldn't be able to come out to be out more often on the landscape. More spring moths coming out year round. And these guys were found across a range of sites here. And then our migrants, which I find them super interesting. These are insects that usually live in the south year round. They migrate up north following the frost line. But you'll see here, we have them coming out way earlier when the frost line probably would have still been present. And then looking at our daily temperature range, we see more evidence kind of disproving our 5 degrees threshold. So this red line here is the 5 degrees Celsius. These stars at the top, these are going to be feeding buzz events. So that's events where on our acoustic recorders on the landscape, we actually captured bats consuming a bug, which we can hear on our acoustic detectors. And so we do have proof that our bats are feeding in the wintertime. And 6 of 8 of these actually occurred directly outside the hibernation site. And then just looking at our prey abundance, so this is just the top of the list, or the breakdown of the list of the insect species that my volunteers were able to find. So I worked with an entomologist at the New York State Museum to identify all the pinned insects to species. And although this is like a little cheating right now, all the red arrows there actually refer to insects that we were able to identify from guano samples as well. So, and leading into the identifying prey species through molecular guano analysis, how does the available prey compare to the actual prey? We know that they are coordinated. We did guano collection from bats that we captured in the net in the fall, in the nets in the spring when we did fall and spring netting. We also did some of the summer as well, because why not? Why not get, see what's out there and what they usually use for the habitat. Maybe their diet changes on Long Island because no one has ever studied this species diet on Long Island. And we did have 1 sample from the winter time, which was, it is unfortunate we weren't able to get more because that would have been the kind of the pinnacle of the study, but it's a bit difficult to get guano, like a little grain of rice from a bat in a crawl space or in a cave site, especially when it's only a single individual roosting. And then, you can see here on the side, I have pictures of our bat. This is how they actually were getting into the crawl space, was through a tiny little missing grate here on the side of the house. So we have, this is our single sample, our guano sample distribution, just a single sample, like I said, from a hibernation site that was from Nantucket, and that would be in orange. All the Nantucket samples are in orange. The blue is going to be our Long Island, and the gray is Martha's Vineyard. So the majority of our samples were from the fall. And then looking at the Martha's Vineyard sample, or these are all of our, suspected roost samples. We actually determined that some of our sites, we had big brown bats and the northern long-eared bat, the Myotis septentrionalis, roosting together in the spring. So that's more proof of these bats intermingling and spreading their white nose syndrome around. But moving on to our DNA analysis here, this is breaking down all the samples and all the relative abundance of different insect orders in there. So we have the most diverse diet was in our fall. We had 8 of 11 different orders in there. The most often consumed, which kind of matched what we thought we would knew was the moths, Lepidoptera, and the Diptera, the flies were the most frequently consumed. They made up the majority of the prey year round. Breaking down into individual seasons here, we got our Diptera, our flies, our Lepidoptera, moths, and the beetles, Coleoptera, made up the majority of the breaking that down. When we look at the fall, the fall diet relies heavily on Diptera. These are the fly species here, the Trichoptera. In winter, in past diet studies, we've looked at bats defecating well into winter. Usually when bats are defecating in the winter, it's made up of like a chitin, which is indigestible part made up of usually found in beetles or the other insects. Our 1 winter sample here was mostly fly, which is interesting because it's something you wouldn't expect them to find in the winter. So it's not a sample, it's not a species that would have been collected in the fall and been sitting in it. That's a fresher, like lower level chitin in these samples. So that was very exciting to see. And then looking at the spring here, we once again see Lepidoptera in the diet, although in a lower number as compared to the summer. And we see our Diptera flies are taking up the majority for the spring diet here. And then in the summer, this is the big boys. This is where you get the most bang for your buck. So you have your beetles and moths, your Lepidoptera is the moths, the Coleoptera is the beetles, Hemiptera is our bees, and our Diptera would be our flies again. But it is the most, fall would be the most diverse time. Summer is the largest prey species here. And then just to kind of conclude everything that I've said so far, we do know that the insects are on the landscape throughout the winter months, that their activity does correspond with our bat activity. And our bats, they do have a shortened hibernation season, but they do seem to still be feeding on these insect prey, and the prey that we have found. The insects that we've captured are the same prey that the bats have been eating throughout the rest of the year, as we determined through their guano analysis. So it looks like, it looks like the winter feeding may be a technique these bats are using to survive white nose in the face of white nose syndrome. And then I just wanted to include this for you guys. It's my favorite video to show to non-bat users. This is a slow release bat flying away video. For all you bird watchers, it's probably interesting to see how they fly too. So I thought it'd be fun. All right. And thank you guys so much. I hope you enjoyed my talk. I hope I didn't bore you too much with some of the scientific details at the end. I'm still working through a bunch of my data, working on publishing that, getting it all kind of concluded up. But I hope you enjoyed learning about bats today and learning about the work that I've been doing on Long Island. If you have any questions, I can definitely answer them.
If you look in the chat, there are some questions there, I believe.
Oh, perfect. The bat wingspans, yes, that depends on the species. I actually don't think I know off the top of my head how big the northerns are. It's usually about twice their body length. But if you're talking about like the bigger ones, like the hoary, the silverhead, those guys are going to be like 18 inches,
Oh, wow.
which is pretty impressive. Yeah, that's why people always think bats are much scarier than they are, because they look so huge when they're flying. What caused a loss of transmissions?
You said that there was breaks in your data. Do you have any idea what caused the breaks?
Yeah, so with the acoustic detectors, it's sometimes difficult because I mean, we obviously, with everything, you get equipment failures from time to time. With these guys, it also depends on, it records ultrasonic noise. So if there's a lot of rain, wind, interference like that, it could fill up your cards or kill your batteries more quickly. Sometimes it's just a really cold stretch. Like we'll have a week of really cold weather and a battery that should last 3 weeks dies in 3 days. And so because it is an endangered species that we were studying, we can't go to the hibernation sites more frequently than every 2 weeks. Otherwise, we'll cause unnecessary disturbance. So we did kind of have our hands tied a bit with that one.
Do you get an opportunity to track the body of the bat after they die or something? Do you have that ability or no?
Once the transmitter, so in the fall, when we put on our radio trackers, we track the bats for 3 weeks. Until the transmitter dies. There's been 2 instances where we were able to recapture the bat simply because we tracked them to a tree. We were able to pull them out of the tree, take the transmitter off, put a new one back on, and in both cases, the bat then flew away and we never tracked it again. So it's pretty difficult radio tracking with bats simply because they can fly such large distances, and especially on Long Island with the interference that you encounter, it makes it somewhat complicated. And then since these bats we're looking for bats hibernating in crawl spaces, the minute you put a bat into a cement crawl space, your ability to detect them drops drastically. So if we're not within a certain distance, or if the transmitter is not strong enough, the signal won't be able to actually make it out of the underneath of the crawl space. So the hibernation sites we have found, we were fortunate enough that we track the bat to a chimney of the house or the top of the house, and then we were able to put an acoustic detector in the house in the crawl space and have found that way. So we've never tracked the bat into the crawl space because we were having to get signals down there. Yeah.
Casey, I want to
Yes.
ask you something. When these bats, I know, I remember seeing things where they've been going into caves and cleaning out the caves so that bats can survive, right?
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
seen
that's
that done. Is there anything and now I'm just nature lover. I don't have any kind of your training. But I'm saying, is there, because they like the morts, certain morts and anything, and people raise butterfly morts, whatever, is there anything that can be help them with injecting into like a mort to help them? I
Or
know that sounds,
like
something that they might
re-
eat might help them.
yeah, like rearing moths to like specifically for outside a known hibernacula, so that when the bats come in the fall they can
Mhm.
forage more aggressively. Yeah, so that's been one of the things people have been kind of working on. It's this whole like this they've discovered over the years that bats, since the introduction of white-nosed bats, are actually going into hibernation sites heavier. So they're calling this bat hypothesis, that the reason like little browns are able to survive in New York is that the bats were that the bats now are going in at a much greater weight. And so in the north, or sorry, the Midwest are actually looking at putting up like UV lights outside hibernacula to attract more insects. That's one of the projects people have working on. I mean, there's all kind of issues with that. I've worked with a bunch of entomologists, and there's this insect Armageddon. So the idea of kind of luring insects, which are already on a decline, just
Okay.
to feed bats is tough. And then it's this whole idea of how it's going to negatively affect the forest, the ecosystem around there. Other people have talked about spraying bats with some sort of like a high protein food, or a high energy kind of like goo that they will clean themselves off, because when they get into hibernation they'll clean themselves a bunch. That could help supplement their fat stores. So they've looked at different ways to increase bat weights, but it seems like the bats that are able to survive from year to year are learning that they need to go in heavier so they can last the winter.
There's a
Okay.
number, Casey, you've got a few questions in the chat.
Yeah.
One question, how far do bats travel in one night? So the bats flying over my house in the summer, where are they coming from? By which I believe she means, are they coming from nearby?
Yeah, so the bats that would be over your house in the summer would be foraging nearby. They do have a much smaller foraging area, like 20 kilometers, depending on the species. Bats can travel, at least the smaller myotis, so the northern long-eared bat, the little brown bat, those can travel up to 50 kilometers in a day. But that's usually when they're going towards a hibernation site. That's when they're kind of trying to make good time. And you'll have bats, what they'll do is they'll actually forage in an area for a period of time, 3, 4, 5 nights, and using similar trees, either the same tree or all around, and then move a bit. And they'll be foraging. A lot of our studies were looking at how the bats utilize the landscape here on Long Island despite all the development. And they're, as long as there's fresh water somewhat nearby, the bats will actually use these very, very tiny patches. So you think, if you're living in a neighborhood and, you have houses on all sides of you, but there's like a nice little, maybe 1 acre of forested, backyards all connected, the bats will actually be using that. And the northern long-eared bat specifically will be using that. So even these small green spaces are super important to kind of help giving them some habitat to use here.
So another question, we have seen bats in Queens Parks flying around during warm winter days. Are they finding enough to eat?
And it's not necessarily a question of are they finding enough to eat, because there will never be enough insects in the winter to give them enough food. Even on the best winter nights, we're still only seeing a couple hundred of moths, whereas these bats would be eating, many times that in a normal evening. But when you're considering they're not foraging for 2 or 3 hours in the winter like they would be in the summer, they're only going to be out for maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour, or they're changing hibernation sites. So it's just the fact that even a little meal can kind of supplement. If you can just offset the energy that you wasted waking up that night, then it's enough to help them.
Something I'll interject is that when they did the West Nile surveys, they found that there are significant numbers of mosquitoes that are wintering in the sewers in the city because they are warm enough to keep them active all year.
Yeah.
Yeah. So another question, do you have tips for identifying bats in flight?
Yeah, so it's one of those things that watching them fly, the more you watch them, the better you'll get at learning it. Generally on Long Island, you'll be seeing big brown bats, red bats, and you might be seeing like a myotis species, so a little brown or a northern long-eared. Most frequently, you'll see the red bats, and you can kind of tell those pretty distinctly because um, the way that they fly, I mean, they're fast flyers, but they're always out earlier in the day. So they'll be the first one you see at dusk when it's not even quite dark yet. And they have, like I said, a very distinctive white fur on their belly. So when they are flapping, you can kind of see flashes of white. And then especially the males are so bright red that if you see them, you'll know instantly. The big browns look a little bit like loopier when they fly because they are a bit more of a slow flyer. They're more like the hoary or the silverhead, the migratory bats. And they do look quite a bit bigger. The big brown's actually almost 3 times larger than the northern long-eared bat or the little brown bat, so distinctly larger. And then the northern long-eared and the little brown, you actually probably won't see them flying over your house because they like forest interiors or edges. So they're the ones who are taking those trails in the nature center. So if you're out late night hiking, maybe at Blydenburg, maybe you'll see one of those there because they like to kind of ride the trails and catch the insects in there, mainly because they can avoid predators when they're in an interior space.
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of questions about bat boxes. Mostly, are they used by what species? Is it year-round or seasonally? And should we be cleaning them?
Yeah, so you do need to kind of refresh your bat box every once in a while if you have one, mainly because if it's not being actively used, a bunch of other things will move in there, specifically most often it's bees or wasps or things of that nature. And we do see a lot that are empty, and people ask this all the time. There's always questions about building bat boxes. And prior to white nose syndrome, we recommended it a lot because there were a lot more bats. But if you consider that we've lost 6 million bats, there's that competition resource kind of thing going on where there aren't that many bats anymore. So they don't necessarily need to use a bat box on a house if you have really nice habitat nearby. So, people, especially upstate, I get this question all the time. And when you live, right on the, butting up to that around like parks or even in like a very open, forested area, there isn't really a need to build a bat box. I do recommend it on Long Island, specifically when you get further west, when you people that live in Nassau County, because you will see a lot of bats kind of using them as their stopover, their flyway point. And there are a lot of things to consider when you build a bat box, what direction you face it in. If it gets too hot, the bats won't use it because they'll actually get like heat stroke if they're in it, kind of baking the sun. But the most successful bat boxes are ones that are actually placed near places the bats would already be using. So people that have bats in their houses, we get a lot of calls about people that want to exclude bats. It always comes in the summer when it's, a little brown bat or a big brown who's had babies in someone's attic. And they want them out as soon as possible. But at that point, the babies are always tucked in. So if you kind of exclude them, then if you close up your attic, the bats will still find a way in, or you'll get dead, decaying babies. So we usually make people wait. But if you do have bats in or near your house, the best place for a bat house would actually be like right on your house or on a tree adjacent to it. And then that would actually be the most useful bat box because the bats will leave your house and use the bat box instead. But it is, it does take quite a few years for the bats to use a bat box. They have to find it. And that's actually something we're kind of dealing with now. So the newest step in our research is actually looking at building artificial hibernacula. We think one of the reasons the bats might be doing well is these specific crawl spaces that they're using, because it's what they're using on Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and Long Island. And so it's such a weird thing that they're doing that they've never done upstate or anywhere else. So we're working on building almost like a small 6-foot underground, cement box that we can place. And our problem now is trying to figure out how to entice the bats into it. They have lures where you can play bat music, play bat calls, and it'll lure the bats in. But they're not like birds in the sense that you can't do like a call recall thing. A lot of species actually are deterred by other bats. Red bats scare off a lot of bats. So if you have a lot of red bats around your house, or if you play a red bat call, it'll scare away any of the Myotis species nearby. So yeah, I don't really have any advice on making the bats come in to your bat boxes, but if you have good habitat, that's probably why they won't be staying there.
There's no more questions in the chat. Does anybody else have questions for Casey?
I do have one direct message to me. So Alicia asked, do bats eat biting insects, mosquitoes, black flies, gnats. And I'm glad you asked that because it's one of my favorite. So there's kind of this big misconception that bats will eat, 1,000 mosquitoes in a night, and they're the main mosquito eater. So mosquitoes to bats are kind of like a grain of rice, or these kind of small biting insects. So bats aren't going out looking for mosquitoes, but they eat tons of them, by accident, or just when they're flying, they encounter it quickly and they'll swoop it up. So they do eat mosquitoes, black flies, gnats. I got some really tiny fungus gnats and things were found in my guano samples, as well as like 6 different types of mosquitoes on Long Island. But it was just one study, I think back in like the 90s, where someone put a bat into a like artificial space with like a bunch of mosquitoes and recorded for 10 minutes and said, okay, they ate this many mosquitoes, and then extrapolated that out into an entire 8-hour evening. So the study about bats eating a lot of mosquitoes is not true, but they do eat mosquitoes all the time, just not on purpose.
Casey, up in Maine, I had a house, and bats infested climbed up. Was a log cabin. They climbed up the eaves and were in the apex. And I wasn't allowed to get rid of them until migration time.
Yes.
And, that was okay. They weren't making any noises or anything. But what was nice about it, because Maine is notorious for mosquitoes, while they were there, it was wonderful. I could go outside and do the lawn. I didn't need to put bug dope on or anything. And I did put a bat house up there during the time that they were there. And the guy that was the exterminator, he says, in order to track them to the bat house, take some guarana and rub it on the bottom part of the bat house. And it seemed to work, because after they put the cones in the corners of the roof, the bats could come out, but they couldn't go back in.
Yeah.
And for, I guess, probably the last 10 years, I didn't have any problems of mosquitoes on my property. It was absolutely lovely. So I didn't get too close to the bat house, though, I have to admit. But it seemed to do its job. So
yeah. Well, so in that, there has been studies that although the bats don't explicitly eat the mosquitoes, their presence will deter mosquitoes. So they have watched, release mosquitoes into a cage around bats or into an enclosure with bats, and all the mosquitoes will actually avoid the bats. So they, a lot of insects do have like an anti-predator adaptation for bats. They can hear the ultrasonic noise. I'm not sure if mosquitoes do. They're tympanic organs that most moths will actually have them, or a good number of them do, since they've kind of co-evolved with, bats. But yeah, so someone also asked if they aren't saving us from evil mosquitoes. They are. The bats, they are eating so many mosquitoes. It's just that I don't want to, continue this notion that bats eat mosquitoes all the time. They'll prefer moths and bugs and beetles, but they will eat them for sure.
Casey, one other thing I wanted to ask you, is there anything if people wanted to help or donate for this bat research?
So if I would say this, so if you are, you can definitely give out my email address. We are looking to, right now what we're looking to do is test our hibernacula, the artificial hibernacula, actually out in Camp Montauk. But we are looking, eventually we would want to expand and maybe put them in people's yards and people's houses. I'm always willing to talk to people about bats. If you see bats in your house or in your house, I love to get photos. I love to see what they are. If you think you have bats in your crawl space. So you can definitely send out my email to everyone for that. And if anyone's interested in helping on any projects too, we always have things coming up where we need volunteers of some sort. I'm open to that. And then I actually will say I've been working with CTUC with bat research lately. I've been working out in Green Tree. It's a property in Nassau County doing acoustics, actually mobile acoustics out there. So that's a volunteer kind of based survey where you walk with a handheld bat detector that attaches to your phone. And we're tracking bat populations on that property, but we are looking to expand to other green spaces around Nassau and Suffolk. And so we're going to eventually be looking for volunteers for that, people that would want to walk these routes at dusk, kind of, you really do learn the bats because the detector will actually play the bat call for you. So you get used to it. It's a slowed down format, but you can hear the bats and you kind of get used to which species make which kind of call, because they are somewhat distinctive. And then the last thing I will say is that CTUC has a app called BatMap Long Island, where you can track or log bat occurrences. So if you see a bat flying, if you find a bat in your house or anything like that. And we absolutely do use that for the DEC as well for management to help us out. So if people are tracking a bunch of silverhead bats, like I said, we've been seeing a lot of them in the winter. It's one of the kind of the new projects we're hoping to work on there is what's going on with this migratory species that seems to be all over the island in the winter. Yeah, so there's a lot going on with bats, and I would love to hear from people, or if they want to help out, let me know, and I can see what kind of projects we have going on.
Have you found any medication or anything to cure the bats of the fungus?
Sorry, what was that? Is there anything to cure them of white nose syndrome?
Correct.
So they are using something called PEG. I'll put my email in there. They're using something called PEG, I think 3000, 2000. It's and a fungicide that's used in hospitals and like nurseries and stuff. So they've actually been, a lot of places down in the South they do surveys, or they do experiments where they're spraying the inside of the caves with like a fogger of some sort. And that's something that they're testing out, but with a cure like that, you're only limited to sites you can get to, right? Because the fungus can be transported around to a bunch of different sites, and there's a lot of sites we won't be able to get into or you don't know about. Sorry. And then once you clear a site, it's only going to stay clear until another bat comes back with a spore and reinfects it. There's been studies, some of the best ones I've seen are like UV studies, UV based. So they're actually, we have a couple of them going on in New York too, where they bring in a UV light of sorts, kind of what they disinfect hospital surgery rooms with afterwards, and use that to disinfect the cave. And that seems like a really good technique because it doesn't have the adverse effects of other cave flora and fauna that a broad fungicide does. But there is this issue, like I said, all the caves and mines out in the Northwest, they don't know where 95% of them are. So all these kind of techniques that will help inside the hibernacle are great, but only in small scale ones. So a lot of those cures, they're looking at just helping a big, hibernacle that has 300,000 bats, like, we used to have in New York, and they'd be great in those kind of places, but not so successful in a lot of the small ones.
Mm-hmm. Casey, would you mind in the chat room to everyone, put your email up there, because there've been several requests how to help you, how to email you.
Oh,
so
I send it directly to.
If you put chat to everyone, they'll get your email.
Yeah. My apologies. There we go.
There you go. Thank you. Because I think a lot of people would help. I know I would be interested in helping. That would be nice.
Yeah. And then someone asked, can you put the link in the chat for the bat sounds for iPhone? So it's not it's not an app. It's actually a ultrasonic module that you plug into the bottom of your iPhone, and it is for purchase. It's not, I don't sell it. It's Kaleidoscope is the company that sells it. And they have a couple different models, some like really basic ones I think are like $100. And if you just want to go out and kind of play around, then they have some more expensive ones up to $350. Those are the ones that are approved by Fish and Wildlife Service for like endangered bat survey programs. But yeah, there are some options for people. But what I am hoping to do is set up. I've been applying for some grants to try and get a library there of different ones that we can kind of loan out to people so they can do these walking surveys at parks, and we can get a better idea of where the distribution of bats are on Long Island. So something to look forward to.
Casey, I want to personally thank you. Yeah, that was a fabulous presentation.
And I want to personally thank her too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, and good luck with your research.
Yep.
Thanks.
If you find something really amazing, if you would email us at the North Shore Audubon and write us an article, and we'll get you in the newsletter.
Yeah, of course.
That would be great. But thank you so very much. It was wonderful.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Do you want to just send me an email about that so I don't?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right.
Send me a reminder email so I don't forget. All right.
Well, thank you again for a great presentation.
Thanks. See you soon.
Good night, everybody.
Well, good night, everyone. Safe home.
Okay, don't close it yet. I'm getting the address.
Okay.
Good night. Thank you.
Night, everybody. All right, we're good. All right. Jennifer, thank you for the connection and everything. All right.